September 12, 1945. 11 Japanese officials in formal dress climbed aboard the destroyer Lansdowne for what would be the shortest, longest journey of their lives. They'd been told to expect a surrender ceremony. What they weren't prepared for was the sight that emerged as the destroyer rounded the headland into Tokyo Bay. 300 warships, American carriers the size of city blocks, British battleships, Australian cruisers, destroyers from a dozen nations. The entire horizon was steel and guns. Chief Cabinet Secretary Toshikazu Kase would later write in his diary, "A million eyes seemed to beat on us with the million shafts of a rattling storm of arrows barbed with fire." They thought they understood defeat. They were about to learn what absolute overwhelming power looked like when assembled in one place specifically to witness your surrender. 4 months earlier, the Japanese government had still believed continuation was possible, not victory. That illusion had died at Midway, or perhaps Saipan, or certainly after the firebombing of Tokyo. But continuation, a negotiated peace, terms that would preserve something of the empire, perhaps even the conquered territories in Korea and Manchuria. Then came Hiroshima on August 6, Nagasaki on August 9. Between them, the Soviet declaration of war and the crushing of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria in less than a week. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio speakers across Japan for the first time in history, announcing acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, surrender. But the word surrender meant different things to different people. To the Japanese delegation preparing for the ceremony, it meant signing documents, formal acknowledgement of defeat, the end of a war. They'd read about other surrenders in history, ceremonies in railway cars, in palaces, in government buildings, diplomatic theater with unfortunate but necessary outcomes. What they couldn't understand until they saw it, was that the Americans intended something entirely different. This wouldn't be a quiet diplomatic conclusion to hostilities. This would be a demonstration, a message, not just to Japan, but to the Soviet Union watching from the north, to colonial powers in Asia, to anyone who might consider challenging American power in the Pacific for the next generation. The 11 delegates had been chosen carefully. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who would sign first despite his wooden leg making movement difficult. General Yoshijiro Umezu, who had argued against surrender until the emperor's direct order. Cabinet officials, military representatives, men who had helped lead Japan into war and now would formally accept its conclusion. They boarded Lansdowne in formal morning dress and military uniforms. The destroyer's engines rumbled. Tokyo Bay waited ahead. They believed they knew what waited for them. They were catastrophically wrong. The destroyer rounded the headland at 0800 hours. That's when they saw it. The first ships appeared on the horizon like a distant fence line. Then more. Then the scale became clear. Kase moved to the railing, his hands gripping the metal. He counted carriers. 3, 4, 6, then lost count. Battleships sat low in the water, their 16-inch guns trained skyward, in what looked like salute, but felt like threat. Cruisers, destroyers, submarines surfaced in neat rows. Every few hundred yards, another vessel. American flags, British ensigns, the occasional Australian or New Zealand banner. The Japanese officers stood silent on Lansdowne's deck. No one had told them there would be this many. Intelligence reports had tracked American naval strength. Yes, but seeing the abstract numbers transformed into physical steel, into a fleet that covered the visible bay from shore to shore, created a different kind of knowledge, the visceral kind that bypasses rational thought and settles in the gut. I tried to preserve with the utmost sang-froid the dignity of defeat. Kase would write later, but it was difficult, and every minute contained at least a year of suffering. As Lansdowne proceeded deeper into the bay, the dimensions became clearer. USS Missouri sat in the center, chosen because it bore President Truman's home state name, chosen because its deck could hold the ceremony, chosen because it represented American industrial might. A battleship displacing 45,000 tons. Its guns could throw a shell 20 miles. Around it, in carefully arranged formation, the fleet waited. But Kase noticed something else. The carriers sat with aircraft visible on their decks, row after row of fighters and dive bombers. Even surrendered, even with the war officially over since August 15th, the Americans kept their weapons ready and visible. This wasn't trust. This was dominance, demonstrated through overwhelming force, held in careful check. Shigemitsu stood near the destroyer's bow, leaning on his cane. His wooden leg, lost to a Chinese terrorist's bomb in Shanghai years earlier, made the ship's motion more difficult. He'd practiced walking without the cane, practiced climbing stairs, knowing there would be photographers. The Americans would record everything. Japan's humiliation would be documented for history. The other delegates watched the approaching ships in silence. General Umezu's face showed nothing, the military bearing of a man who'd spent 40 years in service, but his hands, Kase noticed, stayed locked behind his back, fingers white-knuckled where they gripped each other. Lansdowne's engines throttled back. USS Missouri loomed ahead. On its deck, hundreds of figures stood in formation. Allied officers, sailors, photographers with cameras ready. Above them, the flag mast flew the same American flag that had flown over the Capitol in Washington on December 7, 1941. Brought specifically for this moment, the Americans missed no symbolic detail. A motor launch pulled alongside. Time to transfer to the battleship. Time to climb aboard and face what waited above. Shigemitsu attempted the gangway first. The wooden steps rose at a steep angle, standard for naval vessels. But for a man with a prosthetic leg, each step became an individual challenge. He planted his cane, lifted his good leg, dragged the wooden one up. Plant, lift, drag. Every eye on Missouri's deck watched. American sailors lined the rails 3 deep. British officers stood in formation. Photographers' cameras clicked in rapid succession. Halfway up, Shigemitsu paused. Not from exhaustion, from the realization of what this image would mean. A crippled Japanese foreign minister struggling aboard an American battleship to sign surrender documents. The metaphor was too perfect, too cruel in its accuracy. But there was no alternative except to continue. Plant, lift, drag. When he finally reached the deck, sweat dampened his collar despite the cool September morning. The other delegates followed, each man's face a studied mask of diplomatic neutrality. But Kase's diary would later reveal what that walk cost. We were displayed like captive barbarians before a victory parade. Missouri's deck was a calculated theater of power. The surrender table sat in the center, a simple mess table covered with green felt and 2 sets of surrender documents. Behind it, 263 Allied representatives formed a semicircle. American admirals and generals, British officers, Chinese dignitaries, Soviet observers who'd been at war with Japan for less than a month. Representatives from every nation Japan had fought or occupied. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the Netherlands, France. Each uniform represented not just a nation but a grievance, a list of dead, a demand for acknowledgement. The Japanese delegation stood in a small cluster near the table. 11 men. Behind them, Missouri's massive 16-inch gun turret loomed like a steel monument. The Americans had positioned the ceremony so the Japanese would stand with their backs to the guns. Another detail that wasn't accidental. But here's what made Kase's hands shake as he gripped his briefcase. The realization that this wasn't even the full American Pacific Fleet. Through careful questioning during the transfer from Lansdowne, he'd learned that dozens more carriers operated further out, that submarines patrolled beyond the bay, that this concentration, this overwhelming display of 300 warships, represented perhaps 2/3 of available American naval power in the Pacific. Which meant the Americans could have assembled this force twice over, and still had ships left to blockade the home islands, and still had industrial capacity to build more. The empire that had ruled Asia's waters for 4 years, that had sunk British battleships, captured Singapore, dominated from the Philippines to Burma, stood on this deck facing the mathematical reality of industrial warfare. Japan had built perhaps 20 carriers during the entire war. The Americans had over 100. Japan's total steel production for 1944 wouldn't equal what American shipyards could produce in 4 months. MacArthur emerged from Missouri's superstructure. The ceremony was about to begin. But for Kase, the true surrender, the psychological acceptance of total defeat, had already happened in the moment he saw that horizon full of ships. MacArthur stepped to the microphone at precisely 0902 hours. The general wore no sidearm, a deliberate choice. He carried no visible weapon, because he stood surrounded by the largest armed force ever assembled in one location. The ships themselves were the weapons. Everything else was ceremony. "We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers," MacArthur began, his voice carrying across the deck through speakers, "to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored." Kase listened to the English words. half understanding them through his diplomatic training, fully understanding the tone. Not triumphant, not vengeful, matter of fact. The voice of a man stating obvious conclusions to an already settled question. The war was over because America said it was over. The terms were these because America dictated the terms. Any other outcome had never been possible. MacArthur spoke for 6.5 minutes. He never raised his voice. He never gestured dramatically. He simply stated facts and invited the Japanese delegation to sign documents acknowledging those facts. Then he stepped back. Shigemitsu limped forward. He lowered himself into the chair with difficulty, his wooden leg extending awkwardly to the side. He removed his top hat and gloves with deliberate slowness, not stalling, but refusing to rush this moment even though every second felt like standing naked before the world. He picked up the pen. For perhaps 10 seconds, he studied the surrender documents. Behind him, on the deck, complete silence. No wind, no engine noise. Even the photographers seemed to hold their breath. Shigemitsu signed. The pen scratched across paper. His signature in Japanese characters made the defeat official. Then Umezu stepped forward, the general who'd argued against this very moment, who'd believed continuation was preferable to this humiliation. He signed without ceremony, without the deliberate dignity Shigemitsu had maintained. Just his name confirming what the Empire already knew. MacArthur signed next for the Allies, then Nimitz for the United States, then representatives from China, Britain, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand. Each signature another nation claiming acknowledgement of Japan's defeat. Each name another reminder of how many enemies Japan had made, how completely isolated the empire had become. But it was what happened next that drove the full realization home. As the final signature dried, a sound began in the distance. A low rumble that built and built. Then they appeared. B-29 superfortresses. The same aircraft that had burned Tokyo, the same bombers that had dropped atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They came in formation, wave after wave, 450 of them filling the sky. Their engines created a sound like sustained thunder. Behind them, 1,500 Navy fighters and dive bombers. The aircraft from those carriers in the bay, now airborne, now demonstrating what 300 ships could launch simultaneously. The formation took 20 minutes to pass overhead. 20 minutes of continuous American air power flying over the surrender ceremony, flying over the assembled Allied fleet, flying over Tokyo itself, just 15 miles away, where millions of Japanese civilians looked up at the sky and saw their defeat written in contrails and engine exhaust. Kase watched the aircraft pass. He understood now. This entire ceremony, the ships, the signatures, the flyover, wasn't really for Japan. Japan was already defeated. The atomic bombs had proven that. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria had confirmed it. The Emperor's surrender broadcast had made it official. This display was a message to everyone else. To Stalin watching from the north. To colonial powers wondering about Asia's future. To any nation that might consider challenging American dominance in the Pacific for the next 50 years. The message was simple: don't. The ceremony concluded at 09:25 hours, 23 minutes from start to finish. 4 years of war, 30 million dead across the Pacific, ended with signatures on paper and a massive aerial demonstration overhead. MacArthur spoke his final words. "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always," then stepped away from the microphone. The Japanese delegation stood uncertain. No one had briefed them on departure protocol. Were they to leave immediately, wait for dismissal? The Americans had choreographed every other moment with precision. But this final detail remained unclear. Shigemitsu gripped his cane. Umezu stared straight ahead. Kase clutched his briefcase, still feeling the weight of those million eyes. An American officer gestured toward the gangway. Time to leave. The delegation moved as a group. Their studied diplomatic neutrality starting to crack now that the formal ceremony had ended. Shigemitsu's descent down the gangway took longer than his climb. Exhaustion and relief competing with the need to maintain dignity, one final time before the cameras. The motor launch carried them back to Lansdowne. As the destroyer's engines engaged, and they pulled away from USS Missouri, Kase stood at the rail looking back. The massive battleship, the surrounding fleet, the aircraft still circling overhead. From this distance, the scale became even more apparent. The bay looked more metal than water, more guns than waves. We were not just defeated. Kase would write in his diary that evening. We were educated, taught a lesson in industrial capacity that our military leadership either never understood or refused to acknowledge until too late. Every battleship in that bay represented more steel than Japan could produce in a month. Every carrier represented an industrial system we never matched. The surrender ceremony itself, the signatures, the speeches, those were formalities. The real surrender happened the moment we saw those ships assembled and realized what they represented. Back in Tokyo, civilians who'd watched the flyover began returning to their homes. The war was over. Officially, finally, completely over. Food distribution would resume. The bombing would stop. American occupation forces would arrive. Kase and the other officials knew this, had been told to expect it. But occupation meant survival, meant their cities wouldn't be bombed again, meant children might live to adulthood. That night, Shigemitsu attended an emergency cabinet meeting. His wooden leg ached from the day's exertions. The humiliation of that gangway walk would stay with him for the rest of his life. But he'd signed the documents. He'd ended the war officially, even though the war had really ended weeks earlier when the emperor spoke. They wanted us to see it all, he told the cabinet members, not just sign papers. They wanted us to understand exactly how completely we'd lost, and they succeeded. The photographs from September 20, 1945, became some of the most widely distributed images of the 20th century. Shigemitsu signing with his wooden leg visible, the Japanese delegation dwarfed by the assembled Allied representatives, MacArthur standing before the microphone with Missouri's guns looming behind him, the aerial view showing 300 warships packed into Tokyo Bay. But the image that haunted Kase, that he returned to repeatedly in his writings, was simpler. The view from Lansdowne's deck as they first rounded the headland and saw that horizon filled with ships. That moment, he wrote years later, represented the exact second when theoretical defeat became visceral reality. We'd read casualty reports. We'd seen bombed cities. We'd heard the Emperor's surrender broadcast. But seeing American industrial power assembled in one place, seeing what they could bring to bear when they chose to, that created understanding that no report could match. The psychological impact of the surrender ceremony extended far beyond the 11 men who signed documents. MacArthur understood this. The massive naval assembly, the careful choreography, the overhead flyover, these weren't military necessities. They were theater designed to create a specific psychological outcome, absolute certainty that resistance was not just impossible, but absurd. It worked. In the weeks following the ceremony, Japanese military units across the Pacific surrendered with minimal resistance. Commanders who'd vowed to fight to the last man ordered their troops to lay down weapons. Garrison forces in bypassed islands, supplied and ready to hold out indefinitely, radioed their surrender. The display in Tokyo Bay had communicated what words and even atomic bombs couldn't. Continuation was pointless against an enemy with unlimited industrial capacity. The ceremony's impact reached beyond Japan. Stalin, receiving reports from Soviet observers present on Missouri's deck, adjusted his own Pacific ambitions. The massive American fleet concentration accomplished in weeks demonstrated capabilities that changed post-war calculations. China's Civil War combatants, both nationalist and communist, factored American naval power into their strategic planning. Colonial powers in Asia recognized that the region's future would be shaped by American strength, not European empires. For the men who'd stood on Missouri's deck that morning, the memory never faded. Kase wrote extensively about those 23 minutes, trying to capture for readers what the experience meant. Shigemitsu served in post-war governments, his wooden leg becoming less a symbol of defeat and more a reminder of survival. Umezu faced war crimes charges. His signature on surrender documents couldn't erase his role in Japan's military aggression, and died in prison in 1949. The surrender ceremony itself lasted less than half an hour, but its effects rippled through decades. It established patterns of American Pacific dominance that shaped regional politics into the 21st century. It demonstrated to future adversaries what industrial democracy could accomplish when fully mobilized. It showed that modern warfare wasn't won through courage or tactics alone. It was won in factories, in shipyards, in the unglamorous work of production that America had mastered. Kase lived until 1979. In his final interviews, reporters still asked about September 20, 1945, about what it felt like to stand on that deck, about the moment he saw 300 warships waiting in Tokyo Bay. "We thought we understood defeat," he said in one interview, his voice steady even 30 years later. We didn't. Defeat was abstract until that morning. Then it became steel and guns and aircraft as far as the eye could see. That's when we truly understood. We'd challenged a force we never had any hope of matching.